Hello and welcome to yet another video. I'm Bolboaca and I'm still not yet in the Mozaic Works studios. I'm somewhere else. But I thought that I should record anyway a video about a very interesting article related to software architecture. Before we move on, a bit of a live update. You may hear that my voice is a bit changed. This is because I had COVID and I had the good version of COVID. I'm also vaccinated, so all was good, as good as it could be, but my voice is still struggling a bit. And because of this, I will also have a slightly shorter video than usual, and I hope you understand if my voice sounds a bit weird. Anyway, so what I wanted to talk about today is an article on InfoQ called "The Minimum Viable Product Needs a Minimum Viable Architecture." I've been thinking a lot about this thing. I think there's a very different setup and the different mindset between the architecture and the practices, the technical practices, and the organizational practices that you need to apply when you are starting a new product, when you have no idea whether that product will work or not, and when you have to test a bunch of hypotheses and so on. This is very different from products that are already established, that have a market, and that have, a way to reach their users, and users who are happy with the product and they are using it, and they can provide feedback and can help you more with what you need related to improvements. Indeed, I believe that this is what was interesting about this article. Straight from the title, "A minimum viable product needs a minimum viable architecture." This is true. We need less architecture or fewer decisions or just enough architecture to get started, particularly when we need to test a set of hypotheses. So let's see what the article is saying. The article is written by Kurt Bittner, VP of Enterprise Solutions Scrum Org, Pierre Purer, Experienced Software Architect, and reviewed by Thomas Batts, Laureate Application Architect at Blackbaud. I'm going to switch now to the reader view. The concept of a minimum viable product, MVP, can help teams focus on delivering what they think is most valuable to customers early so that they can quickly and inexpensively gauge the size of the market for their product before investing significant time and resources. MVPs are very useful, and it's been a bit of a confusion about what MVP means, and there's been a lot of discussions in the industry about what is an MVP, what's not an MVP, and the concept got a bit diluted in time, but the idea is still valuable. Have something that people can use and give you feedback. It doesn't have to be shiny, it doesn't have to work perfectly, but it has to show utility. It has to show that people who are trying it, they have to get some utility out of it. And this is what is meant to be testing, from my point of view. And of course, from the point of view of a startup, to gauge the size of the market. MVPs need to consider not only the market viability of a product, but also its technical viability to be maintained and adapted to changing needs over time. That's true. Often you don't have the luxury of rewriting the MVP, although you will rewrite it in parts sooner or later. But ideally, you would have enough technical viability to maintain and adapt it until the point where you need to really rewrite it. MVPs are not limited to startups, since every application has an initial release that can be thought of as an MVP. Yes, this is a very common thing that I see in enterprises. In large companies, they imagine that before suppose they have an existing user base, they can just capitalize on that user base with a completely new product and just go full steam ahead with a complete product instead of using an MVP. And that is quite wrong, because in reality, what you have is a bunch of untested hypotheses, and you can test those hypotheses if you think in the same way as you think when you are in a startup. Now, of course, as an enterprise, perhaps you have more data about your users, so it's easier to understand user base. You are starting from a better perspective, from a better point, but you still need to test your hypothesis with those users. No matter how much you think you know them, you don't actually know them. Unlike mere prototypes, MVPs are not intended to be thrown away. Well, agree and disagree here. You can actually throw away, and you should always be in the mindset of throwing away parts of an MVP, because you need to pivot from time to time. Creating a minimum viable architecture as part of an MVP helps team to evaluate the technical viability and to provide a stable foundation for the product that can be adapted as the product evolves. This is indeed what I've been thinking about. If you have like a mindset for a specific type of architecture for your MVP, you can evaluate this technical viability, you can provide a stable foundation, and actually develop the product better time. So that's quite a good idea. I'm curious if they have any more details on what the minimum viable architecture is meant to be. If making or not making a decision will affect the product's viability and sustainability, or if changing the decision would be so costly in terms of money or time that doing so would make the product uneconomical, impractical, and impossible, then that decision must be made as part of the MVA. Okay, so we get a few things related to minimum viable architecture. If changing a decision is very costly, making a decision affects the product's viability, sustainability, or make the product uneconomic, impractical, or impossible. Right. So it's the set of decisions. Sounds like the minimum viable architecture is the set of fundamental decisions that you absolutely must take. This relates to the discussion we had on real options. These are the options that you cannot delay. Making the architectural decisions transparent helps the organization to better understand why certain choices have been made, which helps them make better decisions about how they can adapt to the product to changing market conditions and evolving customer needs. Absolutely. If you are making these decisions, they should be transparent and they should be assumed, they should be written down. One thing that helps here is architecture decision records. You can write those decisions in architecture decision records. A very good technique. The concept of a minimum viable product can help teams focus on delivering what they think is most valuable to customers early, so that they can quickly and inexpensively gauge the market for their products before investing significant time and resources into something that may turn out not to be successful. Right, and they go into the definition of MVP. An MVP is a version of a product with just enough features to be usable by early customers who can then provide feedback for future product development. A focus on releasing an MVP means that developers potentially avoid lengthy and ultimately unnecessary work. Instead, they iterate on working versions and respond to feedback, challenging and validating assumptions about the product's requirements. And very important part, challenging and validating assumptions. This is what you're trying to do with the MVP. I kind of rehashes the things that we discussed till now. Using modern agile approaches, the product must be able to evolve incrementally based on feedback and changing needs over time. Unlike mere prototypes, the MVP is not intended to be thrown away. This is where a minimum viable architecture plays an important role. Let's see what a minimum viable architecture is. When people use the minimum viable architecture term, they usually mean one of the following: a design involving a minimum set of components. Right, so this would be simplifying the architecture until you only get the simplest, just a minimum set of components. Their design decisions tend to be tactical since speed is their primary concern, and they generally expect the MVA to need to be reworked should the MVP turn out to be successful and evolve eventually into a full-fledged product. The sustainability of a product is not a priority. Components used to assemble the MVA may be sourced from off-the-shelf offerings provided by commercial cloud vendor, low-code or no-code products, or reused from an existing system with minimal changes. Okay, so the first approach is focusing on speed and basically assembling a solution. The advantage for this is that you'll go on and have a quick product. The disadvantage is that it is not necessarily sustainable, because the assumption here is that you'll need to rework the minimum viable architecture. You need to rework the architecture, you'll need to rework the product. The flaw in this approach to MVA is the belief that the architecture of the solution is not important to the customers. But customers do care about the sustainability of the solution, which makes the architecture important to them. As we pointed out in a previous article, this approach may involve significant refactoring of the initial design, resulting in wasted time and effort and potentially creating significant technical debt. Okay. It's still a good way to get fast feedback, right? So I'm not shaming this type of approach. I think sometimes, depending on the risk that you are taking and on the budget you have, this can be the fastest way. Setting up something like a WordPress site with some plugins, something that you can assemble from in 2-3 days and have a relatively okay product that you can test with commercial plugins or something like that. It is very fast. So it depends a lot on what you're trying to test with your MVP. And if you're trying to test utility, it can work really. More than that, something like this, having a WordPress with plugin so on, it can cost you just a little bit of money, maybe a few $1,000 if you go to buying a lot of commercial plugins. And it can also be used to get income faster for a limited period of time, depending on how fast your user base is growing. Okay, the second one, a small set of fundamental choices that the development team has made about the solution. This definition focuses on the sustainability, the long-term viability of the MVP by considering how the product will meet its QARs in addition to its functional requirement while minimizing technical debt to achieve sustainability. As we pointed out in another article, software architectures are driven by QARs, not by functional requirement. The MVA in this approach consists of a minimum set of technical decisions that are tested and evolved using empiricism over time. These decisions are complemented by a minimal set of architectural practices that help the team to keep the product architecturally viable when they evolve it. So the other option is to have a very clear goal, make architecture decisions related to that goal, and with an additional goal of sustainability and long-term viability. And then you decide how to deal, what decisions you make about the architecture. What kinds of decisions shape the MVA? Answering the question of what is just enough depends on whether an architectural decision must be made in order for the product to be viable. If making or not making a decision will affect the product's viability and sustainability, utility, or if changing the decision would be so costly in terms of money or time that doing so would make the product uneconomic, impractical, and impossible, then that decision must be made as part of the MVA. These decisions include how the product will handle QARs that are associated with product system characteristics, such as it's a bunch of architectural concerns: concurrency, throughput, latency, and responsiveness, scalability, persistency, security monitoring, platform, user interface. And of course, you need to make your own decision. As usual in architecture, every decision is contextual to your product, your teams, your organization. You cannot copy decisions from other people because they don't have the same product, the same organization, and context. Okay, it's a good list, I think. It's very important, of course, to know where you need to deploy, so how the product will look like. Is it a real time? Is it an embedded product? Is it a web app? Is it mobile? And then in terms of latency, scalability, what are the important things? How development teams evolve their products MVA? I like throwaway prototypes. A development team builds their initial MVA as part of building the MVP. This is the first release of a product using an agile approach, just as they evolve the MVP in a series of iterations or sprints. They can also evolve the MVA at any point in time. Their product should meet its non-factual QARs. In doing so, they don't burden the product with unnecessary features based on guesses and assumptions, which help us achieve continuous delivery of business capabilities in a sustainable way. Right, so fundamentally, you're just doing architecture. I mean, it's no different from architecture. It's just that you have a shorter term horizon to focus on when you make your decisions as an architect. But I think the way you can deal with this is first by defining the utility and defining that what we want to do is to test utility, and then derive from this general principle what are the most important parts, the fundamental things that you need to pay attention to the architecture. Do you need what type of scalability? How many users do we expect to have? Can we perhaps use a monolith start with instead of microservices or a large distributed application that will give us headaches on operational and monitoring and so on? How much monitoring do we need and so on? These are things that you can define from the beginning. And if you set your goal contained enough, then that will influence everything else related to architecture. And then you can add more things to your architecture, but you'll still need to do some architectural refactorings. Because depending on what happens in the future, you may realize that you need to extract a module, move a module to make it more scalable, which means turning it into a service that can run in parallel in 200 instances, 1000 instances, so on. In short, as the team learns more about what the product needs to be, they only build as much of the product and make as few architectural decisions as is absolutely essential to meet the needs they know about now. The product continues to be an MVP, and the architecture continues to be an MVA supporting the MVP. This is perhaps one of the things that many teams don't realize, is that every one of their releases is an MVP, the hypothesis. The hypothesis that we are testing. So initially we might be testing utility, but then we might be testing, okay, can we get 1,000 more paying users with these features? Can we turn from free users to paying users 200 or 20% of those using this feature on? And then depending on this, your architecture changes, because if you have currently 100,000 active users and you expect to get 200,000, make sure that your architecture will scale and the performance will be good and so on. And so this keeps adapting in time. Now, There is, however, here a bit of a friction between, and there's a trade-off that you need to make. Yes, you can probably split into functional modules at some point in time, but splitting into those functional modules will make the architecture more difficult to manage. So the change becomes, at least on the short term, you go lower. But splitting those modules also opens up the opportunity for better performance, for better scalability. And so there's always this trade-off that you need to take into account between applying architectural principles, like separating things that are changing in the same way in their own module, with particularly when we are talking now about an MVP, when should you make this decision? It's a decision that you need to make in the beginning of the product. You already create a bunch of modules, but what if the product doesn't work? Was that wasted effort? Or is this something that you decide later on, but it will cost you in terms of operating modules? And just make this decision at the last responsible moment, at the moment when you realize, oh, we cannot scale or we cannot have the performance that we need unless we split up module. So this is a trade-off that's very hard to make, and it's part of the architecture. There's no general answer. You'll always have a trade-off. Conclusion, MVPs need to consider not only the market viability, but also its technical viability to be maintained and adapted over time. Creating an MVA as part of an MVP helps team evaluate the technical viability and to provide a stable foundation for the product that can be adapted as the product evolves. All right, very interesting article. I think it's a good one. The question still remains on whether we should make certain decisions at a certain time. I mean, they listed a few of them, and this is a good start because these are the decisions related to architectural concerns. But what I'm missing here, a good start, it's a good idea. As I said, MVPs need MVA. I'm perfectly okay with that. I think it's very well put. And the list of these things, concurrency, throughput, latency, responsiveness, scalability, persistency, security, monitoring, platform, user interface, these are fundamental. But besides that, I think we also need carefully consider how we split into modules. You're doing something like domain-driven design, and you start with an analysis of the domain, and you figure out which are the bounded contexts. Typically, you would organize modules around your bounded context. And this is where you'd have something like a modular monolith can be a very useful. And I'm so glad that we are starting to see in modern languages like Java and C++, the concept of modules with hard boundaries, the first class citizen in development. We need this thing. We need the ability to specify modules, and we need a way to deploy them in various ways. We need to be able to deploy these modules, a modular monolith, in a library, in a service, a long-running process of whatever kind you're using. These are useful to have, and because of this, I think it's important to consider your modules from the beginning, because the module structure will influence things like security, scalability, performance, throughput, latency, and responsive. And depending how you reorganize them later, you will work with these different characteristics as you move along. So perhaps you need better performance in some areas of the application. You may need to reorganize your modules. If you need better scalability, you may need to reorganize your modules. I think it's a very good list, but I would also add think modular. Even if you're doing an MVP, think modular, because if you are successful, things will evolve in time, and then you will need to readjust your modules, and that can also be a very costly thing to do. But if you start with modules based on domain analysis and based on these architectural concerns that are the most important ones in the beginning, I'm pretty sure you can come up with something that is a minimum viable architecture, and it's not more than that. As long as you focus on, let's say, utility, the first step. All right, so this is it for me today. I hope you enjoyed this. If you enjoyed this, please leave us a share, like, subscribe, leave us a comment, ask us questions, anything else you'd like to know. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart.